Morning, this is Lucky Lynx. I'm sort of shifting the direction that the channel is going in now because I am about to this week start my Tibetan Bond cosmology training, and I just wanted to share because I noticed this summer when I was sharing my experiences along this path and how I got to be on this path and how I got to learn some of the things that I learned and what my experiences were. People really like that. So what I kind of want to do now is as I move into this new course of study and start applying it to my work, my business, and my life, I wanted to share with you guys some of the discoveries that I made. And in my case, the minute I learn something, I usually start applying it to working with clients in my own life, and so I want to start this by talking about what happened when I actually first learned the stuff that I talked about in the last two videos, the Tibetan elemental theory that His Holiness Padma Gampa Rinpoche taught me when I first met him, and I wanted to tell you guys from my own. Now, so when I shared what that was, and I'll put the link at the end of this video. To those two videos, so you can look at it. So I shared what the theory was as I had been taught by my master in the last video. Well, now this is what started to happen once I learned this. Once he taught me this, some very weird things happened. I started to look at the world a whole new way. That was the first thing. I started to see the world as this dynamic interplay of these elements, these five elements that were constantly going on. And there was a moment when I realized that because one element was always giving birth to another element, and another element was coming in to feed on that element, and there could be an excess of one element or a couple of elements and a lack of some other elements, I started to notice really why people struggle to find peace. Because everything elementally is always changing around us. Fire flares up, a wind, it comes up and then dies down, water will go to the lowest point it can go, earth sort of like stays solid in the middle of things, metal expands and likes to get into its habits. These are the things I started noticing. And what I started to see in my own life was, the first thing I did was I wanted to find out what elements I was. And once I found that out, I started to understand immediately in my life why certain relationships had not worked in my life. That was the first thing that I noticed. I started to notice what my family dynamic had been growing up based on what the elements in me and them had been, which astrology had never really showed me. It kind of superficially showed me some things in astrology. The tarot showed me some things too, but this, I actually started to see why certain reactions were happening. It was almost like chemistry. I could see why when this person and this person got together, this was the reaction, because it really was the reaction to those elements. And then I started to notice why relationships in my life that I thought would work didn't work, or why relationships that were in my life, what the dynamic was of them at the time. And I started to look constantly for what I'm like, who's, what element is this person, what element is that person, and what are the elements. And then I started to notice too that there were certain places that I felt stronger and certain places that I didn't feel strong. And then I knew why, because I started to look at, well, if I feel stronger in this place, is there something going on elementally that makes me feel stronger? And then is there something going on in this place that makes me feel weaker because these elements weaken me, these elements strengthen me? Now, it was a really interesting experience, because then I started to realize that the world wasn't random. And I think that the biggest problem you face when you're a kid and you ask questions, especially in these religions, the modern religions that are dominating people's thought these days, is that they kind of teach you to believe that there's really no rhyme or reason, that you're at the whim of a certain God, and and there's no other rhyme or reason to it. That you just have to grin and bear it when it's difficult, and that you have to you hope for better times maybe and accept your lot. And what the world started to look like when I started to see it as an interplay of elements was there was a rationale to it, there was a logic to it. And then I realized at that point in my life how logical I really was. And the funny thing is that growing up, people had tried to convince me that I was really emotional. And what I didn't recognize until I noticed and learned this elemental stuff was that the people who were telling me I was emotional were actually very emotional themselves, and they were projecting it onto me. And the world wasn't making sense because people were trying to define it in terms of feelings. Even the people in the sciences, people who were very supposedly scientific that I'd met at universities when I was in academia and stuff, they seemed very dysfunctional. And there seemed to be emotion behind it. When I asked a certain question, either of scientists in academia, or if I asked questions of people who were in metaphysical workshops, they didn't seem to have logical answers. They seemed to be emotional answers. And I was like, well, why is this the case? Well, because that's the way it is. And or in the case of metaphysics, they would say things like, well, what do you think? And which told me that they really didn't know, because they didn't say, hey, well, go try this and get an answer. They were like, well, what do you think? And I was like, no, they were using what's called a hypnotic reversal. So the most important thing was I started to see that the whole world that I was living in had a logic to it. That if a person who was these elements went into this kind of place, they would feel stronger. If they went into that kind of place, they would feel weaker. And that's what I was observing. I was observing it for myself and in my own behaviors, and I was watching other people do it too. And I was watching certain relationships happen. And that if two people who were they were both the same kind of, they were the same elements, they would kind of get stronger, and it would create something that sometimes created an imbalance because there was too much of that element. And when that happened, another one would come in, and I'd see that happen. So like these people would be doing this over here, and all of a sudden this kind of person would come in here. And it seemed like, well, why when we do this does this kind of person always showed up? Well, because the elements were drawing it. That's the way it was. It was like this was giving birth to this, or this was coming in to feed on it. And I started noticing all this. And then I started noticing that everything in the world was either giving birth to something or feeding on something. And it was really an amazing thing. And it was like, whoa, there is a logic to the way the world works, which is what the religions had never been able to show me growing up. And when I'd read, their books and everything, it was always, well, it's God's will, or the one that really bothered me was like, you're here to learn love. It's like, no, there's no logic to that. That didn't show me the logic of things. It didn't show me why in this situation this would happen. And then what I started to really notice then was when people refused to acknowledge, from my experience and from what I was seeing, when they would refuse to acknowledge that there was this kind of elemental logic going on, they would make up all these elaborate reasons why things were going on, based on emotion, based on their feeling, based on stuff that made no sense. And I was like, wait, that doesn't even make sense. It's like, well, your parents treated you like this because you were supposed to learn this lesson for this to make this. And I was like, and it get more and more convoluted. I was like, no, you were this element, they were this element. That's the way they act together. Of course it was explosive, or of course they dominated you, or of course there was this, or of course, you wanted to fight, or of course your father valued guns and you didn't, because you were different elements. So suddenly the world didn't seem so mysterious, and it was exciting. And that's when I knew that I was going down the path that I had been looking for most of my life. Because there was a time in my life where something sort of clicked in me, and I said, I gotta find this. And I didn't know what it was, and I started looking until I found this. And then when I started seeing how these things interplayed, it was like, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. So that was one of my first earliest experiences with seeing how the elements interplay in the world. There were very specific instances where I would apply them and see this result or that result or that result, which was really kind of fun. And then I would get experiments from my master where, you know, he'd say, hey, and I said this in another video, okay, go map this space and see if you can figure out what the colors were. There was one experience I want to tell you. I was in the woods in Illinois, and there are certain symbols that relate to certain elements, and this was one of the most magical experiences I'd had up to that point. I was doing what he said, and I was mapping this area of the woods, and I was trying to figure out what a certain area, what the main elemental energy was. I couldn't figure it out. And I sat there and I said, what is this? What are you? What is this space? And at that moment, I turned, and there was a turtle this big that suddenly walked and started walking towards me. Now, I hadn't seen him a few minutes ago, and he was huge. Now, I had seen turtles there before, little snapping turtles and stuff, but this sucker was huge. And all of a sudden, he was walking through the space. And when I saw that animal, I knew what the elemental energy was, because it is literally the symbol of that element. And my mind was blown. So that was just the beginning of a bunch of experiences like this that started happening in my life that made me more and more convinced that what I was learning was actually giving me access to something that was much bigger than what I'd ever been taught in my life before. I'm Lucky Lynx, as always, wishing you success and good fortune in all that you do. Tomorrow maybe I'll talk a little bit more about the dynamics of the relationships that I had noticed, or what happened in spaces that I had noticed when the spaces were kind of at war with themselves. One of the most interesting things I did begin to see was how people who had different elemental energies were at war with themselves, or how they could project that then onto other people. But I'll talk about that maybe a little bit more in future videos. So I'm starting cosmology this week. I'm going to be doing Tibetan astrology charts very soon. Probably in a couple weeks, I'll probably start doing people's charts, because people have been asking me since I started this channel, do you do astrology? And I've always told them that I will be honest with you guys. When I was doing Western astrology, I always felt like I really wasn't giving people real tools, because I saw so many places where Western astrology fell down, and I felt like I didn't really feel honest about it. So I stopped doing astrology, because I felt like it wasn't really getting people where they wanted to go or giving them the information they really wanted. So I waited, and I'm glad I did. But I will be doing Tibetan astrology for people very soon. I'll be doing their charts very soon. Within a couple of weeks, I'll be doing this stuff, and I'm going to start to talk more and more about what my experiences have been in Tibetan Bond, what my experiences have been with these unusual magical phenomena, and the cosmology stuff that I'm going to be learning. I'm going to start to talk more about my experiences, and as my experience grows and my understanding grows, I'm going to share some of those experiences with you guys. If you would like to get a reading from me, 779-302-8009 or conjurehope@gmail.com. And I am still doing tarot classes, guys. If you still want to take a basic class, and by the way, I still love the tarot. All this time, I've still used the tarot, and I still use playing cards. I still use Mexican Loteria. I still use Crystal Ball. I still use Lenormand. I have classes in all of these if you would like to learn, and I will show you how to use these suckers like a pro. So if you're interested in taking a class, any of these classes, contact me, 779-302-8009 or conjurehope@gmail.com. And like I said, if you want to get a reading from me, same way, contact me. We'll do a reading for you. Hey, if you want me to do your kill core, I'll explain all about that. If you contact me, if you want some changes to happen in your life, there's a way to apply bond processes, and those bond processes will start to make shifts in your life, supporting. And they can also remove obstacles. If you want to do any of that, contact me, 779-302-8009 or conjurehope@gmail.com. For those of you who have donated, thank you so much for donating. I really appreciate it. And if you want to donate, I'll put my PayPal, my Venmo in the thing below. So I'm looking forward to these new changes, looking forward to sharing them with you guys. You guys have a fantastic week.